ahoro. Humie, huie, tākie. Nau mai, haere mai, and thank you for making time for this important LIANZA panel in Kōrero, Libraries, Local Government Reform and Navigating Change. I'm Paula Reskett, hidden behind a blank screen, having tech issues, working from home today. I'm LIANZA's Professional Development and Events Lead, and we have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you today, whom I'll introduce you to shortly. As you've just heard, the session is being recorded, and if you have questions for our panellists, please pop them into the chat and they'll be monitored by Laura and I in the LIANZA office, and Lorinda. Our panellists today are Alison Dobie, Chair of LIAC, the Library and Information Advisory Commission, General Manager of Auckland Libraries, 2010 to 2016. Alison led the amalgamation of Auckland Library services for 1.5 million people during the 2010 amalgamation, and also the amalgamation of Dunedin City Libraries in 1989. Catherine Leonard is Head of Library and Learning Services for Auckland Council Libraries. Catherine has played a key role in leading, navigating and executing the post-amalgamation strategy for Auckland Council Libraries. Denise Wilson is a former LIANZA appointed board member. She's a library strategist and leadership consultant. She also supported 7 eLGAR libraries before and after Auckland Libraries local government amalgamation. We have Stephen Penrasco. Stephen is Head of Public Engagement at Canterbury Museum. He's a former LIANZA councillor and Director of Library Services at Hamilton Libraries. And facilitating today's kōrero is Lorinda Thomas. Lorinda is Director of Archives New Zealand, former manager of libraries, community spaces and city archives for Wellington City Council, and LIANZA President 2013 to 2014. I'm sure you'll all agree we have a mighty panel. Thank you all for joining today, and thank you to our panellists for all your time leading up to today and including the time you're giving us now. I'll hand over to Lorinda to begin our kōrero.
Kia ora. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Paula, and all of our empathy for the tech issues. We all know that it's not a real webinar unless there is some kind of technical difficulty that happens at the beginning, so thank you very much. In the lead up to this webinar, the panellists and I were able to get together and have a talk about the kinds of things we might chat about and discuss today, and one of the things that came through very strongly is that there is far more content in this topic than can possibly be covered in a single webinar. So please do very much treat this as an introduction to the topic, but also do put your questions into the chat. One of the things that we're quite interested in exploring is what are some ways that we can continue on this conversation even past today, and how can we help provide the information and answer the questions that you all really have. So please do engage with the chat, and some of our panellists will also be engaging with the chat too. So just do go ahead and do that when you're ready. So there is, as I'm reflecting, there's a huge amount of content here. So we will go through with our panellists, but different people will jump in. The best webinars are always a bit of a conversation, and I will interject some questions in here too. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I will start, first of all, just with a question for Alison, and this is really around the Auckland Super City amalgamation as it was known at the time. And libraries were really seen as one of the big wins of that amalgamation. But in fact, the work of bringing those libraries together for that collaborative work started far before the actual Super City kind of was stood up. With eLGAR, the Libraries for Greater Auckland Region. And so, Alison, I wondered if you could talk a bit about bringing those libraries together to work collaboratively. What was it that made it successful, and what lessons did you learn through that change process?
Kia ora koutou, and thank you, Lorinda. I'll do my best on a big topic, but first I just want to start by acknowledging what you're going through, particularly those of you who work in local government. Amalgamation processes are always incredibly stressful and challenging, especially at this early stage of the process when it feels like everything is being done to you. So I just want to acknowledge that for you. As you said, Lorinda, eLGAR was formed about 8 years before the amalgamation, initially consisting of 5 libraries being Manukau, Auckland, Waitakere, North Shore and Rodney. And we established a shared library management system around 2005, which was kind of the big foundational achievement. And that was partitioned still by each local authority, which meant that on day one of the new Auckland Council, we could remove the partitions and offer all collections to all residents across the region. And that was recognised as the best and most immediate benefit of amalgamation, and it was very good for a library's reputation. But I would reflect that there were other aspects of eLGAR's collaboration over that 8-year period that I think were more important to its success. Firstly, the establishment of strong relationships at a leadership level and deeper across libraries. This was a very deliberate approach that we took. We worked to build trust and shared understanding, and it was something that we actually worked very, very closely at. It wasn't accidental. We also worked very hard to establish strong leadership, not joint leadership, but that the leaders of the eLGAR libraries worked to a common purpose and could speak with a unified voice and give a sense of direction to what we were doing. Thirdly, early on, we established a quite strong vision for eLGAR, which is one that we returned to often to check our direction and priorities. And fourth, we learned to put forward to our chief executives and the regional CEOs forum workable solutions, not problems. We were spending millions of dollars doing a project that was unique across 5 local authorities, and we needed their trust. And we saw that other parts of councils only ever went there with problems of working together. So we demonstrated that we could work together, put forward solutions, and then deliver on the proposals that we had made and build trust with the CEOs in that way. And I think that did stand us in good stead going into the amalgamation. So all of that gave us a very strong foundation to work from moving into the amalgamation. For example, we were able to co-design joint proposals to shape the future of what the library service in Auckland would look like. And we were the only area of council able to do that because we were the only area where the managers knew each other and were working closely together. Our design proposals were sometimes successful, but not always, but I think it helped. Our strong relationships were critical. Like after the amalgamation was announced as one Auckland, we sat in the room and together and looked at each other and realized that these are my dear colleagues whom I trust and love, and we are now competing for one job. How are we going to do this? So we spent deliberate time working together to establish a basis for trusting and respectful relationships that would use open communication and sharing what was happening to us and respect. And again, that was something that we did consciously to help us through. Once I was appointed, and of course my perspective then becomes different, I'm sure, from my colleagues, But those leaders remained strongly committed part of the team. And I think that was immensely important getting us through the amalgamation. Finally, we were almost overwhelmed by our success. Like, we did great promotion of that. People could now have one library card, access to 55 libraries and those huge collections, and they picked that offer up to much greater extent than we had anticipated. And we were overwhelmed by that success and almost completely, almost failed entirely. But the fact that we had teams established and deep relationships in place meant that we were able to respond quickly, to work miracles and find solutions that got us through. And we remained as the swan above the surface, but incredibly stressed and hardworking below the surface. But I think it was the eLGAR relationships and trust that helped to get us through that quickly. So what would I say are the key lessons from that long collaboration of eLGAR getting us through the amalgamation? First of all, thank God for eLGAR. Secondly, that it was bloody hard, much harder than we anticipated, and incredible commitment and necessary. The third learning is that you can do more together, so it is worth it. Fourth, I learned that all that collaboration can only take you so far in an amalgamation when it comes to people. At heart, we were still 7 different library systems with different values, different histories, different identity, different priorities, different visions. And so the sense of loss and upheaval, confusion, once we came together was immense. And much greater than I had anticipated. And so that was really a massive learning, that while we thought that we were prepared and ready, and that eLGAR had helped us to get there, at heart, people were still immensely, and as they should have been, immensely loyal to their own library systems and feeling the loss of having to move into something completely unknown. So the response had to be to create space to celebrate and honour the past, but also to move quickly to a future focus and to establish a new shared vision, purpose and values, and also to start working on some future focused design that would help us look forward. Again, really, really tough. And I think Denise may well speak to this, very tough, and realising that takes a long time. But I think all of that still helped by the strong relationships that had been embedded. So the one thing I would say to you, that is always in your control, regardless of what stage in an amalgamation process you are in. You can always reach out to build strong relationships with colleagues in neighbouring authorities before an amalgamation, during an amalgamation process, and after an amalgamation, because there will probably be a next time. Kia ora.
Thank you, Alison. That's a really great set of insights to start us off with. And I'm interested in this conversation too, just about the amount of, there's a number of years actually in advance of eLGAR before the amalgamation happened. So there was a degree of kind of proactiveness, I guess, in that approach to change, because there was sort of, already established those relationships. And thinking about, I guess, that proactive change where you're sort of doing it to yourself. Stephen, I wanted to ask you about the Canterbury Museum experience. So you're currently closed for, I believe it's 6 years, and usually a closure of a site for that length of time would kind of be seen as kind of a major, a really major loss of service. Can you talk a little bit about how you've approached that and kind of the challenges and opportunities that that's created?
Yeah, kia ora tātou. So, look, the unique situation we found ourselves in was not lost on us. This is a once-in-a-lifetime project, a major rebuild of our facility. And I guess we could have viewed the closure as an extended pause of service or a byproduct of what we were undertaking. But we deliberately chose to see a different way of delivering our service. And I guess we accepted that we couldn't simply wait 6 years for the building to reopen. Just like libraries, museums see our audiences as being young people. When you have children of your own, you tend to bring them to the library, you bring them to the museum, you bring your grandchildren, and it's that sort of that same rhythm that we see across the GLAM sector. So the idea that a child turning 5 the day we close the museum might not visit the museum until they're possibly even 12. And once the child hits 12, you're intermediate and school visits start to become harder. So we feared what that loss of continuity might bring going forward. So we asked ourselves, how do we stay relevant? And it was about partnerships. And I'll admit the museum probably didn't have strong relationships. We had connections, but not active living partnerships. So we went out and we met with the Arts Centre, libraries who have been amazing, go figure, the art gallery, community organisations, and basically said, look, while we don't have a whare, we would like to come and participate with programming and education with you. And the idea behind it is, if we both do half the effort, we can both yield the visitor participation numbers, and it's really good profile for all of our institutions. So it's led to greater collaboration with the cultural organisations. I'm now in regular conversations with all of these institutions, and go figure, we all sort of have the same motivations and priorities going forward. What I'm hearing a lot is revenue generation offsetting the high cost of running, and I know that that's something that always sort of grates the gears a little bit when it comes to libraries and museums. But that idea of free programming, low cost programming, and premium programming is something that's working across all of these organizations. And we're now in a situation where we're collaborating a lot more around those ideas, and we're actually forming inter-institutional partnerships. So that's really great. So I guess at the foundation of our approach was a mindset that although our building was closed, our purpose wasn't. It has never changed, and staying true to that. And just something I wanted to say after listening to Alison, collaboration's not new, and libraries have collaborated for decades. So reform just leans into those relationships. I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think the museum had terribly good relationships at the beginning, but man, it's quick and easy to form them. So totoking what Alison said, start forming the relationships now, create those networks. They will help you through.
Thank you, Stephen. And it's kind of, I'm reading a few comments, as we're kind of going through in the chat as well, just about, that change in the 8 years lead up, for example, to amalgamation that eLGAR kind of had in Auckland, and kind of knowing that you were going into that 6-year kind of phase of change as well, has kind of given you a little bit of a run up. And I know that in the current local government reforms, in their latest iteration at least, it's felt very sudden, from though I'm not kind of in local government now, the way that change has kind of been rolled out has really kind of been very, very sudden, it feels like. And yet we also have kind of known that it was going to happen in one form or another kind of for several years now. There was kind of attempts under the previous government as well to kind of look at local government a bit. And one of the things that, what the panelists and I kind of talked a little bit about was that change can kind of often happen in phases. One of the expressions I've heard recently, which I find really fascinating, is that change is not an event, it's a skill. And so I wondered if, Catherine, could you talk a little bit about kind of that change that just kind of seems to be, I guess, kind of continuous, or kind of happens in continuous phases, and when it feels like that, how do you approach that kind of change where you might not necessarily have the lead in, but you are just kind of in that phase, that going from one change to another?
Thanks, Lorinda. Kia ora koutou. So acknowledging that this particular change in local government that we're talking about does feel quite sudden, and suddenly this deadline at the end of August is looming and there's a lot of uncertainty. But I think as leaders, it is our role to always think about evolution and change. If we're not thinking about our communities or our profession or our services, then we're not doing them a good service, because nothing stays still and constant in our world. And I know that that can feel exhausting. And some people have more appetite for thinking about change and what could be than others. I think what makes it hard, probably in almost all institutions, very much in local government, is that the conditions and the triggers and the timing will seldom, if ever, be in our control, in our part of the business. It does often feel like it's being done too. But I do think you have to think about the opportunity it provides, even though it might feel hasty, and it will feel quite pressured. It would be great if we could always make change in a much more incremental and planned role. So we didn't look at what ends up being a structural change as a way to deliver some things that we think might be better for our services anyway. It seems to be the place we end up in. So in my time at Auckland Council Libraries, I've lost track of how many restructures we've been through, some small, some not so small, but Auckland Council Libraries now is a very different structure to what it was. And even the role that Alison obtained after that big amalgamation, we don't have a role like that anymore. We have a much more dispersed sort of leadership model, which is vastly different than what it was. I think the thing that stays the same that we can all connect to, I think Stephen just mentioned this really well, is that our purpose doesn't change. The kaupapa of libraries remains the same, the professional conviction, the commitment, delivering great services for communities, targeted programming, supporting digital inclusion, great collections, provision of research and information services, that remains at our core. So I think we don't have to question that. It then becomes an issue of don't fight the organisational reality. Think about how you can step into this, to Alison's point, demonstrate that you've got some workable solutions and you've done some real deep thinking about what can work, rather than taking problems or just fighting against that thing that is not going to shift. So I think accepting that reality and then thinking about what it will be. I think the other thing that libraries and librarians as information professionals are good at is being curious and reaching out. So I think that's the other thing. We do not have to know ourselves all of the answers, but we do know in our sector we can tap into the research and skills and knowledge of so many colleagues who are so generous in sharing that. And an example that comes to mind for me is one of our more recent restructures where the context was cost savings in a very specific area in library and learning services, which was our research and heritage space. So there was no context. It was very much you need to find this dollar amount of savings. And I think the expectation was we would say we could just establish a certain number of roles and deliver that. But instead we thought about there's some work to do in this space. What is the service we want now? And what would give us a good foundation in the future, acknowledging that hard reality of we probably will lose some roles along the way. So we reached out to our colleagues in the glamour sector and really tested some of our thinking around the challenges we have. And I think what was very comforting and somewhat validating is that so many institutions, nationally and internationally, that we reached out to, we were grappling with the same issues. Like, what do you do now, and where are you heading? What's your direction with these services in the future? So we could sort of take some comfort in knowing these weren't new, unique problems. They're very much shared. It was a bit of a surprise then when we came back to our finance and governance people on this to say, we want to redesign the service. And they sort of looked a bit shocked and said, well, we just want you to deliver savings. It's like, well, actually, we can't be that blunt about it, because if you want us to keep delivering great services, we need to do things differently, and we will also deliver the savings. So I think that that's an important lesson to remember. You are never on your own, even though you may feel like you are. There is always so much knowledge that you can tap into on this.
Thank you, Catherine. I think too that for me that kind of brings up a really kind of interconnected aspect of it. One of which is you don't fight the organisational reality, but also how do you make the most of the situation that you then kind of find yourself in? And it can be quite challenging to hold both of those positions at the same time. And yes, having kind of been through this myself also, I find that really fascinating. Just kind of, I guess, continuing on too from that kind of concept of, the organisational change and that instinct that we can sometimes have to sort of fight against that or rail against it. And also just noting kind of Alison's previous comments too, just around that kind of sense of loss, I guess, too, in the Auckland amalgamation situation. I wondered if we could go to Denise, because Denise, your role actually involves helping a lot of organisations and libraries through change. And what do you see as kind of the common reactions to change that people go through, and how can we help them move through that in a positive or a constructive way?
Kia ora toto. And thank you, Lorinda. Gosh, there's so much going on here, and as people are putting in the chat, so much gold. And yes, I was privileged enough to work with Alison and all of the library leaders across the Greater Auckland region before and then after amalgamation. And since then, I've been working with many, many libraries across the sector through change. I think we have to acknowledge that there is so much uncertainty in these situations. And I think it's not really the change that's as scary as the uncertainty. And I think particularly for librarians, in a good way, it's often scary. And so I think it was Siren that put in the chat what was lost through the Auckland situation. Well, I witnessed a lot of loss. And I'll give an example. We came together. I was tasked with bringing together a project to do the first pan Auckland Super City summer reading program. And it's not really about the summer reading program, but it's the first time that representatives from all of the 7 came together to create something new. And there were people in the room for whom very little had changed, and there were people for whom they were grieving the loss of their manager, their leader. But what I would say is that, uncertainty, loss, speculation, fatigue are normal. But what helped people through that, I guess, was the focus on the community, the focus on, as Stephen said, what's our key purpose, building the relationships. But it was really, people came together around, okay, so we're all going through this different, some were grieving, some were feeling that, what do they call it, soldier's grief, because they were fine, but they were watching these colleagues that they loved going through hardship. but they, the reality was they created this amazing project around focusing on the community. Because when you get back to it, that's what libraries are about, right? They're about caring. The intention is clear, delivering amazing stuff for the community. So what I saw was, yes, there was loss. There was fear of losing identity because I, for those of you who don't know Auckland, the north, the south, the west, the east, everything. I worked across all of 55 branch libraries. I ran workshops with all of them. And the loss was huge because people were saying, well, what are we going to become like McDonald's, where we are all going to be exactly the same big Auckland super city? But that's not what happened. Through focusing on the communities, the focus, people started to realize that actually they weren't losing as much as they thought. Of course, they'd lost people, of course. And that had to be acknowledged, as Alison said, but they didn't lose the identity of their communities. And in some ways, they became stronger. And I saw libraries really, I left them with a challenge that was, okay, if you're going to create the best customer experience for your community, what is that going to look like? Man, they just went for it. And so and that gave them a purpose, right? So I think the leaders don't need all the answers, but people need honesty, they need empathy, they need a purpose, and they need involvement, right? It's not being done to them, and focus on what people can influence. And I think that whole circle of control is quite a practical tool. On these concentric circles, on the outside, you've got what's concerning you, which is real. Then you've got what you can influence, but then you've got what you can control. And I think if we can help our people be clear about those different layers of that circle, then, and just as an example, I'm working with some public libraries at the moment who've been thinking, oh, maybe we should just not do the strategy that needs to be renewed, or not do that piece of work because we don't know what's going to happen. And no, they're actually going, actually, regardless of what happens, we need to prepare, right? We need to build the capability in our people. We need to be clear with our purpose and what libraries are for and what we can be doing in our community. And so I think that that strength of, it's not about removing uncertainty, it's about helping people move through it. And having a plan, Stephen, you're absolutely right. That's what this work is about. Actually saying we can still have a plan. We're not going to be able to remove the uncertainty. But the other thing in terms of building capability is that you'll then be ready when you do have an idea of where you're going. Kiara?
Thank you, Denise. And hearing you talk about having all those people in the room too, it reminded me very much of, sort of the cycle of change that people kind of go through, and they, a little bit like the cycle of grief, where they kind of go through denial and
Yeah.
resistance, and then kind of move into, looking for the opportunities. And actually just the recognition that people can be all over that at different times. And so you can have somebody coming out the side of acceptance and other people, someone else who is still kind of in the pit of despair. And for leadership, that is quite a challenge, because you have people at really different stages of their journey requiring different support and different things through there too.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I do quote the cycle of grief, but I actually don't think it is that cycle, which is not linear, but it's still,
Yeah.
it goes back and forward as well, right? And I think Stephen's point about consistent communication, I think consistent communication and transparency, often leaders feel they've got to shelter their team from what's really happening. But I think actually involvement, obviously there are things that you have to decide and compartmentalize, but I think involvement and, hey, we've got this challenge, what can we do together, makes people feel less like victims and more empowered.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up, I guess, on that theme of kind of the uncertainty that change creates, both for those people who are going through it, but also for our communities as well. And I wonder, can I call on Alison and Catherine just to give us some thoughts here? One thing that I think we are seeing very much in the media with the local government changes, and I think we have seen it too in central government, actually, with some of the changes that are kind of going on around machinery of government, is the fear that is kind of within communities that they will lose this kind of thing that they love, and this kind of, this service that they have come to know, and that they are losing kind of a part of their identity through that. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how we can work with our communities through that change so that they also have kind of, I guess, a better transition path for the change.
Hello, Linda. I recall in 1989 what the community identity was, didn't even arise. The amalgamations, it was you just basically were absorbed, and a new system was put in place, and that was it. So 2010, all the feedback through the consultation processes was communities talking about their fear, like the importance of who they were and their fear that that would be lost. And it wasn't just the fear of the 7 local authorities, like within each local authority, there were multiple different communities with distinct identities. And I think we were helped because we had quite strong customer research that we'd been undertaking over a few years. So we already had a quite strong sense of what our different communities were and how they were distinct for each of our libraries. And so it was a matter of how we could reinforce that, really. I think the critical thing about the amalgamation is in a way, it enabled a consistent and standardized process to be put in place across all libraries, so that the customer experience at each of the libraries was similar in terms of how you were treated for whether it was overdue charges or how your reserves were displayed, or or how you were treated, that you could come to expect kind of a consistent, high quality experience. But on top of that, staff were then freed up to respond to local, to understand and know their communities and respond to local, because those foundation processes were in place. That took quite a long time to achieve, naturally, but I think now that it has been achieved, and when I walk in and out of Auckland's libraries today as a customer, the critical thing is that the people who are working there reflect the community, and they know the community, and the buildings look like the communities, and the collections look like the communities, and the events and programs reflect communities. And that's because the staff in some ways are so much freer to focus on those things rather than worrying about the underlying processes, which are addressed and standardized regionally. I think in 2010, the focus on community itself wasn't as strong as it could have been, because really the focus was on people and making the library systems work, and staying afloat. And so our promotion was really telling the communities, like, this is what's now available to you. So I couldn't honestly say that we designed with the customer 100% in mind. There were other areas that we had to focus on, but the outcome in the end has been to celebrate or enable celebration of individual community.
Thank you. Catherine, did you have some thoughts on this?
I think that's just a lovely way for me to segue into this, because I think, as Alison said, Now, definitely for Auckland, but I would say for all of our public libraries, they are so fundamentally connected to community and listen to community. So there will be a range of formal and informal relationships that are in place. And I'm thinking, for instance, mana whenua relationships, community group relationships, specialist roles we have within our organisation. In Auckland, of course, we have got the local boards, which are just key relationships for the service delivery at the local level. So I think we are so attuned and really sort of integrated into that way of thinking about what's local, what's regional, and how you find a balance with that. I think our greatest advocates in that space are our staff who work in those community libraries because they do know their communities. They know the people, as Alison said, they look like the people in their communities. I think what it does do in a time of change is, though, it places quite a lot of weight on their shoulders sometimes about being perhaps a spokesperson on that. So particularly if they have local board members, media, politicians walking into the community library and saying, we hear this is going on, how do you feel? So that's a really, really difficult position to be in. The sort of loyalty and the willingness from our community and sometimes our politicians to sympathise, empathise is not always helpful when we're actually working within some constraints and have been tasked with doing quite a big job. No one wants to hear their local services might change or be trimmed. And it's really a burden, I think, as leaders, we have to think about how we manage that for our local staff. So it comes back to what's already been said a few times, communications, clarity, and transparency, providing real clarity where you can to staff about what they can say, by default what they can't say. So they've got a feeling of safety around how they communicate what's going on. I think we all know that when you've got a void, misinformation grows, right? So it's avoiding that when at the same time there is a lot of grey and uncertainty. So how you provide some clear comms to staff around what they can say when a process is underway. And often that process in local government land, there will be a consultation, there will be a staff consultation, there will be a community consultation. So making it really transparent to community about how they will be able to engage in what the process is, while enabling our staff to still navigate the tricky space of potentially being in change themselves, and still delivering a really good service at that time. So I think that's the other thing about it. I guess the other thing to say is that Auckland Council Libraries now, with 57 community libraries, widespread and huge diversity, there will always be ways to design something that works, that gets a balance of regional and local. And I would by no means say that Auckland's example is perfect. We're always working on it. It's always a balance. There's always some tension. There's always some challenges. But it is what keeps us on our toes around ensuring we're constantly working at collaboration around what Alison mentioned, what can be delivered and designed regionally that takes a lot of that overhead, those things that can be consistently done at scale, for example, like your collection provision, that takes all of that, creates some efficiencies, probably creates some cost savings, really delivers value for money. So you can sort of proudly say, we are achieving value for money, to our governors, but we're also delivering for community because we're trying not to compromise either. We're trying to find a balance. So I think it's around that shared commitment on outcomes, letting people sort of play to their strengths so you can do what makes sense at scale, but then support delivery and just enable that to develop locally, be tailored very differently at the community library level. I think one of the things we talked about when we were discussing this session was the kind of blueprint idea. And I think this comes up in it's come up in every change I've been involved in. Like people really want a map for what exactly it will look like. And we never have it, right? But it's kind of creating enough confidence in staff as well, that the ongoing commitment to the kaupapa remains true. we will find a way to work through this. We know what our principles are, we know what our council strategies are, we know what the outcomes are that we're driving for. We just have to find ways to work into that space where we get the right balance, and keep delivering. I mean, I think the other thing that public libraries are always in the position of is nothing stops. So you've got to keep going, even when things feel like they're pretty shaky. So it's a real balance, but I think it is around providing comms and clarity where you can, and it's probably never going to be quite exactly what people want, but trying to make up stuff will backfire as well. So it is around that very cautious, this is what we know now, this is the process, this is how you will be involved. And we know it always ends up to being a bit longer and more painful than we'd like, but that's the nature of being a public entity too, as well. We have to tick so many boxes and show we're actually doing the right thing by everyone involved.
Thank you, Catherine. And as you were talking about this, I was thinking about the role, I guess, of providing enough information for staff to enable them to kind of feel empowered through this process, and actually being able to provide some consistent messaging that staff can kind of use at the front desk when they're asked, saying to people, I'm not going to have a view, but you can have your say, when the consultation document comes out, for them to understand how they can be involved and at what point that will happen, are actually kind of all empowering things for the staff that are going through that. And one of the things that I think this kind of recognises as well is that actually at some point all of us have often been through more change than we understand that we have been. One of the examples that came up when we were talking previously was about COVID, and that actually, the experience of COVID was actually a very big change that we all had to adapt to in all of our different services through that period. And so this one's for Stephen and Denise. You've particularly kind of, and Denise, you've seen this change through the eyes of many organisations that you've kind of worked with. And how do we use kind of our previous experience of change to kind of build on that and to tackle the new kind of challenges and uncertainty that kind of comes up when we're facing something new? How do you both approach that?
Change is inevitable, isn't it? And I guess organisations that thrive aren't necessarily the ones that rush into it or resist it. It's possible, comes back to staying absolutely clear about your purpose while remaining flexible about how we deliver. COVID is such a great example. Local government didn't know how to cope with COVID, and it got delivered to libraries. Help people with vaccine passes, help invent new services to create to maintain social distancing. So libraries, we're so good at this. It's our bread and butter. I think we are delivered a lot more challenge than we probably realise we get. I think I was lamenting that straight after COVID, all the local authorities started tightening their belts, and one of the first places they looked for savings was libraries. Yet we had helped them through what was quite a unprecedented time. Denise?
I absolutely agree with everything you've said, Stephen. I know that's rare, but hey, I'll go with it today. Just kidding there, sorry. But I also think every change, to your point, Stephen, we've been through COVID, there's AI, we're always going through stuff, and every reform, every change is different, but the leadership principles endure, they're the same. And I think one of the things we can think of here is, I think it's Catherine was talking about confidence. I think the investing in capability before you need it, actually shoring people up, preparing. It's not about predicting the future, but shoring up some capability that you're able to adapt enough to thrive under different futures. And that's what happened with eLGAR. As Alison said in the chat, it wasn't 7 or 8 years of preparation. The initial structure was around a library management system. But what happened prior to the amalgamation, when that kind of happened to these councils, there was such an amount of preparation that went and kicked in. And I think building the capability, being transparent, involving your people, it's already there, like you said, Stephen, with COVID and so on. I just think that we reframing it around the common purpose that libraries have, and preparation is something that every library can do today. Doubling down on understanding your community, having that clarity around your purpose, and having the empathy with your staff, and just starting that collaboration if you haven't already, and I'm sure many of you already have. But it's capability building, for me, it's building capability on many fronts, and then you can be positively moving towards the common purpose without feeling that whole victim thing of it's being done to us. And then you're ready to start designing solutions when the moment comes.
Thanks, Denise. I really liked that phrasing of thriving under different futures. I feel as though that is kind of it's a great framing, because we have talked quite a few times throughout the session about kind of that purpose and that real clarity of vision, and being able to both hold the vision while also recognizing that there might be a variety of different futures, and none of the, it's not just one future that's good. Actually, many of these futures can potentially be good, and actually it's about how we can take advantage of the situation that we find ourselves in, and acknowledging, I guess, too, that there will be things that are different, and some things will be felt as bad and other things will be felt as good.
And there are opportunities, there are opportunities of growth through the discomfort, without ignoring the fact that it's hard and there will be loss, and everything won't be the same, and people will not have great outcomes, and it's terrible and it's horrible, and Alison can speak to that. It's difficult, but at the same time, reframing it for the people who have to endure is a leadership responsibility. And I think it can be, yeah, Stephen says innovation comes from constraint, and I'd say also you don't get growth without discomfort.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think building confidence, building on Catherine's point, I think building confidence is really important.
Yeah. One of the questions or comments that came through in the chat was about the COVID and the dialogue and the kind of the confronting questions sometimes that staff can get at the front desk, and how exhausting that can be. And I wondered if all of the panelists, just kind of as a last kind of wrap up to the session, I wondered if you'd all mind contributing just something that I guess you do to kind of remain calm under pressure, or to kind of recenter yourself, because it's very stressful in a leadership situation often to be balancing those kind of pressures. And I wondered if you'd all like to share just something, a tip or something that you use to get you through those times.
I'm going to jump in on the silence. Often as a leader, you are dealing with the cray-cray that's coming at you from all directions. Hopefully, your people don't necessarily get the full impact of that. And I think as a leader, do not share that with your people. Like, you've got to take that on the shoulder. Your staff look to you more than you realize for guidance. If you are holding the helm calm or appearing to be calm, your people really respond to that. And during COVID, my leadership team and I were down on the floor, engaging with the staff, being part of the front face. It's so easy for the mayor or someone to say, oh, libraries, you deal with it. But if you can front up and show that, but don't bitch and moan. You might have a whole lot of turmoil in your head. Use your network of peers to share ideas. And just know that, yeah, your people are always watching you. So be that calm leader.
Thank you.
One of the things that the eLGAR leaders did was that we always socialised together frequently. Like we celebrated birthdays, we created opportunities after meetings to socialise, and that was actually really, really important support, because those were often the occasions when you could share and talk about things that were troubling you, or, you know, just build the relationship. And we were sometimes teased about it, but actually it was critical to us being able to remain centred and strong, knowing that that support was there and there were people there around us that we could share with and talk to. So I don't think that can be underestimated as a way of remaining calm and strong as a leader. And also knitting is useful.
It's funny.
I'm happy to jump in. From a very, very personal level, I would say you have to look after yourself. You have to find ways, whatever works for you, whether it's a walk on the beach or going for a swim or yoga or reading a book, find a way to tap out, and just remember you do have to look after yourself because so many people are actually relying on you. I think the other thing I have found useful is having a friend who is not of our world at all, where you can do a little bit of a discreet a discreet friend, a little bit of a reality check, and you can go, am I going nuts here, or do you think, I'm kind of holding it together, or have I lost the plot? But I do think for me, it's always holding on to your vision. So you've got to be listening all the time to what's going on around you, but also to get through this, I think you've got to have a real vision for where you're trying to get to. And if you've built that vision based on it being good for the service, good for the profession, good for our people, good for our kaimahi, good for our professional staff, you can hold on to that and know you actually are doing a good thing here. And that sort of sometimes helps with the noise that you might hear.
Thank you. Last but not least, Denise.
I'm going to come in because I agree with everything everyone said, and I don't have anything to add. I'm just going to come in with a little comment for the people on the ground that is, and I've had this conversation many times when staff have said, oh, I've been faced with this, I've been faced with this. And then when we've had a chat, just by reframing and saying, it's not going to make it any less hard, but it's not about you. They came in with their problem, they came in with their situation, and whilst you might feel angry, frustrated, scared, many things, it isn't about you, so they can release that part of it, that it was really their issue, their problem. And people, including myself, have found that incredibly useful.
Thank you, Denise. It's a great set of reflections. I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank all our panelists for the session today. I know that we are at time, so I want to make sure that we can get everyone off promptly. And I think I will just hand back to Paula to close our session with a karakia.
Wow, that was absolutely incredible. For those of you who are using your digital logbooks and writing a learning reflection on today's hui, I imagine many of the words of wisdom and quotes are going to appear. We could just about have a separate webinar on the gold there. Thank you all so much on behalf of LIANZA and speaking for the 116 people who joined us today. Thank you for your time, your wisdom, being so open, and generosity of sharing your time, which I know is incredibly precious. LIANZA will have a recording of this on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. And I will just close with a karakia, thanking you all again. Have a great day. And the words are in the chat if you'd like to join along. E te hui, whaia, te mātaranga, kia marama, kia whai take, ngā mahi katoa, tua maia, tua kaha, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. Kia ora everybody, take care.